Hi, my name is Willem Ellis, and I'm speaking to you from the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa. And I want to share some ideas with you regarding conflict transformation and approaches to conflict transformation, especially the utilization of traditional methods of conflict transformation in the African sense. Just to explain a bit about myself, I come from a background of law and political science and became involved in conflict transformation during the 1994 election period in South Africa, where we, for the first time in 300 years, had to get people together, people that had been separated by legislation and by culture for quite a while. And we had to get them together in a new political dispensation. We had to get them together in peace committees, and we had to assist them in together addressing the new challenges facing South Africa at that stage. And we had to use every bit of wisdom that we could find, whether that be traditional African wisdom or whether that be, let's call it, imported Western wisdom as far as mediation, facilitation and other processes of conflict transformation is concerned. Now, something that's quite important is just to realize that when we talk about indigenous conflict transformation mechanisms or approaches, it's not mutually exclusive with what we have seen to be and described as the Western methods, as mediation or facilitation or peace-building processes are sometimes called. They are not mutually exclusive, and very often they are generic characteristics that they share. Now, if we look at traditional approaches from the African continent, which has been here for hundreds of years in pre-colonial and pre-contact times, and exist in a variety of societies right across the African continent, east, west, north, and south, there are a couple of generic characteristics which seem to be present wherever we go. And these seem to be the fact that they are very much consultative in nature, that it is inclusive, that the role of elders are seen to be very, very important. And I smiled yesterday while reading some material when I came across the African saying that said that young people standing up cannot even see what elders can see sitting down. So there's a lot of trust and a lot of emphasis placed on the wisdom of elders. They're seen as legitimate and they're seen as wise, and they are often utilized then in these indigenous conflict transformation structures. Also, these structures are aimed at looking at issues of transformation, at issues of forgiveness, of issues of a sense of belonging. So it is not adjudicative in nature. It is not about who's right and who's wrong. It is about how do we address the current process, how do we go into the future, and how do we live together as individuals, as a group, as a society, as a tribe, as an ethnic faction, whatever you might call it, into future. And I think there's a lot of wisdom that we can gather from that and that we can learn from. What is quite challenging then is how do we combine some of these more traditional approaches with some of the Western or imported approaches that we currently see on television when people mediate and when we see people on the steps and of big buildings and where peace agreements have just been signed. We don't always know what forms of mediation were followed in there. We have no idea what the processes were. We just see the end result. And it would be very interesting to see whether in such negotiations on the African continent, whether African indigenous approaches were utilized in the mediation processes. And I think it's important that all of us that are involved in the world of conflict transformation, that we get together, practitioners, academics, whether we government, whether we military, whether we civil society, sit around and reflect and share our experiences, very much so with African indigenous approaches on the agenda as well. I think there's a lot of potential for African indigenous approaches to be utilized in, let's call it, modern conflict approaches. One of the major tragedies of the African continent is the issue of state fragility and states that are collapsing or have already collapsed. And one of the major pros of using indigenous conflict resolution approaches is the fact that they're not state-centric, that they're not linked to the state, but they are linked to specific localities, specific areas, specific communities, often are, and that they don't lend their legitimacy to the existence of the state, but that they can operate in an area divorced from the state. In such a case, you can utilize these approaches to create what I could call islands of peace areas where we can create stability, and from there on create impetus and create forward movement as far as creation of peace, or of an environment for conflict transformation and negotiation to take place. So that's quite a positive point when we look at the utilization of traditional conflict approaches. I think also the use of elders, the use of village elders or community elders, very much reflected in the African Union's panel of the wise at the moment. So we are grabbing back to the indigenous approaches, to the roots of our continent, and to the roots of the way that we do things. And I know of very few societies where the wisdom of the elders are not appreciated to a large extent. So I think the challenge lies in really grappling with the history and the makeup and the potential of these indigenous approaches, and then juxtaposing them to the Western imported approaches, and see where is there areas where they complement each other, where are they in conflict, and how do we create, as far as is possible, a hybrid model. And I think the hybridity of the model is quite important. If we look at conflicts on the African continent today, we will find that they are hybrid social exchanges. A number of actors involved in conflicts, a number of motives behind the conflicts, and a number of agendas on the table. And that hybrid kind of conflict needs us to have a look at a hybrid solution, if possible. So that hybridity we will find in traditional approaches and possibly in our newer Western approaches. I say again, these are not mutually exclusive. I think it's quite important that we realize that in both traditional approaches and in modern approaches, there are elements of facilitation, elements of mediation, elements of using wisdom, and elements of peace building in all of them. Challenges in doing this? Yes, many. I think one of the major challenges as far as traditional approaches are concerned is the fact that many of them originate and is still perpetuated in a patriarchal society where the role of women in peacemaking, in mediation processes are not acknowledged. And we know for a fact that in many of the conflicts on the African continent and wider than that, women play a significant role in creating circumstances, creating environments conducive for negotiations, and also participating in negotiations themselves. Mostly on a track 2 basis. Women have been not so well represented on the track 1 basis of negotiation, but I think there's a lot of scope for addressing that process, and that the question of gender mainstreaming, as far as that is concerned, should also be addressed. Also, what is important is we should realize that Africa has more than 5,000 different cultures, different languages, different approaches, and different worldviews, and we cannot homogenize it all into one approach. So the danger is always there that we try to create one blueprint and we make it applicable to the whole of Africa. That cannot be done. 5,000 cultures, 54 states, how many languages? There is no one single blueprint. But those who intervene and those who are involved in conflict transformation processes should always be aware of the fact that we need to contextualize the process. Certain processes peculiar to West Africa, other processes more peculiar to South Africa or East Africa, or wherever you work. You need to work with the correct blueprint in doing your conflict analysis, planning your intervention, getting the right actors involved, and taking it forward. And we must acknowledge that in certain parts of Africa, those traditional methods and approaches just do not exist anymore, that they've been impacted upon so heavily by factors like colonialism, evangelism, globalization, and the fact that in essence they can't contribute anymore. But I think somewhere in the middle, and we all know when it comes to politics and when it comes to conflict, there's hardly ever a situation of black or white. It's always some shade of gray in between. And I think what we need to do in our efforts to find this hybrid model is we're looking for the right shade of gray, finding that real workable solution that involves the best that traditional African approaches to conflict transformation has to offer, and combine that with the best that the Western model has to offer. Think about that.